All right, we are now live for the first AMA session of 2023. So, new year, slightly new look for the thumbnails. And we've already got one question here, a very interesting one. I think that I've never been asked this question before, and it's kind of a cool one. When did you learn how to drive? Do you have any advice for first time drivers? So, I think a lot of people in America, unless you're living in a really big city like, say, New York City or maybe even Chicago, most Americans learn to drive at one point or another. And, we even have like driver's education classes and, various curricula. And I was kind of an outlier in part because I was in driver's ed at my local high school that I wasn't going to, but I was attending it, and then I wound up that summer in juvenile detention. So that was the end of that, and then I didn't actually get a driver's license until I was around 20 years old, and I think I got it because it was kind of an inconvenience not to have it. Also, my mom was getting a new car and wanted to pass her older car, a Pontiac 6000, which was, kind of a beater, but for me at that age was a great car. I actually went through quite a few accidents with it. Um, and came out quite okay. So I was like 20 years old, and I think it was the summer. And what you have to do, when you're a little bit older, is take a written test, and then you do a driving test. And you got to fill out some paperwork. And I remember I actually like lost points on something that I thought was kind of BS on the driving test. But it all came out okay. And it's kind of funny that you asked me about that because at the age that I was at the time, 20, it was like a huge step, in driving. I think part of what I didn't like about driving was the fact that you were responsible for this 1-ton piece of metal that could easily go the wrong way. And I thought a lot of my peers were a little bit too cavalier about um, how they viewed things. But I got used to it, and then I got to like driving, and then I learned how to drive stick, and that was kind of fun. And I drove a dump truck around for a while. I've driven quite a few vehicles. Actually, I should mention that when I was in the army, the first thing I actually learned to drive officially was a M113 armored personnel carrier, Vietnam era, that we had as combat engineers. I kind of forgot about that because I wasn't a driver. I definitely didn't want to be a driver because it was like too much extra work and hassle, and you didn't get paid anymore for it or have any perks. But I got used to driving, and I mean, now it's something I just kind of take for granted. You hop in a car and boom, you're off. So advice for first time drivers. Um, you know, I would say that it's easier to learn how to drive not right in the middle of a busy city, but sooner or later you do have to learn how to drive in cities. And, a car is a big responsibility. Um, for a lot of people, I think it's kind of a symbol of freedom, but it's also, there's a lot of work involved in taking care of a car. So that's a very interesting place to get started with. And let's see what else we've got. T. Douglas says, just got here. How are things? Pretty good. The semester is about to begin at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. I've got two classes there. I'm also doing, as I'm going to make an announcement, not today, although you'll hear me say something about it right now. But next week, I'm going to be doing a not for credit personal enrichment class on Rene Descartes' meditations and the objections and replies. And I've got a bunch of other irons in the fire as well. I'm working on a book on Epictetus. Um, I've got a lot of other things to do, shooting videos, podcasts. I'm doing some local talks here in the Milwaukee area that I've been invited to give. So there's a lot of things going on, and things are going pretty good. I haven't hit the gym yet, but I'm hoping to get there tomorrow. Um, and I got a lot of cooking to do, and my oldest kid will be up here starting tomorrow again at University of Wisconsin Milwaukee, so we'll get together and that'll be kind of fun. um, Actually, so I'm going to take Bruce's thing right here, because it's relevant to the car question. Bruce says, I started driving at 25 years old and taught myself in a brand new 1977 Chrysler Cordoba. That's, that's a classic car now. you know? So that's kind of cool. That sounds kind of kind of fun. Now, teaching yourself how to drive, that sounds a little harrowing. And I think Bruce at that time would have still been in Birmingham. So I can't imagine in a big city like that driving around myself. I think Bruce perhaps has more courage than I do when it comes to that. All right, back up to the other ones. Mark is here. So happy new year. Hope your festive season was good. Here's to another year of great philosophical discussions ahead. Anything in particular you're looking forward to? Yeah, there's a lot of things I'm looking forward to. Now, looking forward doesn't mean that they're going to happen necessarily, right? But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I want to start doing more writing on. I've got some academic projects that I want to work on. Some on my own, some with collaborators. And I should mention that Mark is one of my collaborators, as is Scott Terulli, who some of you have seen with the metal shows, and then Harold Kavli, who just took over Stoicism today, stepping into the footsteps. I won't say boots because I didn't leave any boots behind, but footsteps I left behind, and now he's in charge of that. But he and I do a lot of collaborative work together. So yeah, a lot of cool stuff going on. Nice to see Ken here as well. Happy New Year. Hope 2023 is a good year for you. Hope it's a great year for you as well. Salda X is wishing Happy New Year as well. Jacob Murphy, have you read any Ian McGilchrist? I've never even heard of Ian McGilchrist, so I haven't read them. David says, I was planning to write a commentary on Schopenhauer's World as Will and Representation. Any tips on doing a large writing project? What makes you keep coming back to a commentary? So a couple things there. Yeah, big writing projects. So there's a little like charting it out and figuring out what you're going to do aspect to it. If you want to get that published with a traditional publisher, there's also like hoops you got to jump through, like doing a book proposal, and that can be kind of a pain in the butt the first time around. As an author, you learn a lot of stuff by making mistakes, I would say. But I think that a lot of the planning that you do for something like that, and Schopenhauer's World as Will and Representation is not a small book. That's a big, thick book. So a commentary on that would be quite a lot of work. Um, this is where like your writing and research work kind of comes together with all the rest of your life, right? So this may sound a little silly, but you almost have to pay more attention to the other things that you need to focus on in order for your life to be not getting in the way of the intellectual work that you're trying to do on Schopenhauer, for example, and the other people, obviously Kant and Plato and other people that he brings up in that. So like getting regular exercise, making sure that you're taking care of yourself, you know um, making sure you have what you need in order to do the work that you want to do. I mean, setting yourself up with a good place to do the reading and work. That's all quite important, I would say. As far as my commentary, so I did mine is kind of low hanging fruit. I did those commentary videos on Epictetus, the Enchiridion, years ago, and then I remastered them and finished the remastering, I think this summer, maybe this fall, and now I'm taking the YouTube transcripts of all of those videos and going through. They're very raw. YouTube gives you basically just strings of text that don't have any punctuation or capitalization, and sometimes get some of the words wrong if they're foreign words or if my accent trips it up. And so I'm taking all of that and editing it. And I've released some of those on Medium, and I've released more of those to my Patreon supporters, but there's still a lot of work to be done on that. But that's shorter work. And then I've got a former student who is going to do artwork for it, and I've got other people lined up to help me out with it. I'll probably self-publish it, through Amazon Publishing. So not quite the same thing as you're looking at doing. I think what I'm doing is a lot easier than writing a commentary on world as uh, will and representation. All right, let me take some more. So Leslie says abuse disabled me from working towards a career, marriage, and friendships I sincerely want. So I compromised with a high paying job and wife despite being gay, like Esau losing his birthright. How can the idea of new creation and God redeem these compromises? I avoid temptations, but it seems too late to glorify God by being fully alive. Well, I mean, let's take God out of the picture. Epicurus says it's never too late to do philosophy, and I think that that's quite right. And by do philosophy, he doesn't mean just read books. He means like get your life in order and attain some measure of happiness consistently. And it's never too late for that. Although there are quite a few obstacles. The older we get, the more set in our ways. Typically, we are. Although sometimes getting older helps you, and you can realize, I'm not gonna all that silly crap over there. I don't need to care what those people think, or there's aspects like that. But yeah, I think there's a lot of people where it could be abuse, it could be other trauma that people go through, it could be just deprivation, it could be not knowing how things work. So many of us in academics who are essentially first generation, not just college students, but first generation to go to graduate school, don't have a clue how things actually work in the very rigged game. But that doesn't mean that you can't, so long as you're still alive, make some choices for yourself that would get you some of the things. The having a wife who's a beard, that's kind of tough, you know. But those are things where I mean, it's good to have a high paying job because that gives you a bit of financial security, and you don't have to bust your hump. And people come out to spouses all the time, and sometimes the spouses are really betrayed and ticked off, but sometimes they're understanding. So all right, Andre, is The Universe Next Door by James Sear worth reading? I don't know. I don't think I've I you know, the title sounds familiar. It might be something if it's a short story that I read a long time ago, but it doesn't, the author's name doesn't ring a bell to me, so I don't really think I could say. Um, Jordan says, I watch a ton of your Hegel videos. I didn't know you were an army guy. When did you get out? Over 3 decades ago. I was in during the end of the Cold War, and when we started to realize what was called the peace dividend, with the Warsaw Pact falling apart, and they started just, demobilizing people. My unit was down to 65% strength by the time that I left early. Um, and then shortly afterwards, totally new mission. Uh, Desert Shield started, then Desert Storm, but I was out by then. So, Nanessa, what is your middle name? Brian. It was named after Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland. I think in part because my mom had so many Irish friends. She did the naming of me, so Gregory after Gregory the First or Gregory the Great. The Pope who didn't want to be Pope, who left some good writings behind and did a lot of important work. Brian, and then of course Sadler, our fake family name. I say fake because I'm adopted to begin with, so I'm not genetically related to the people who adopted me. But my dad was the first in our family to be born as a Sadler because his grandfather changed it from the Slovenian name Skufka, and he did that in part because there was so much prejudice against Slavic people, especially South Slavs, at the time that he did that. He wanted to get into business, and so he picked the most English sounding name he could find. So, all right. Sayed says, would you recommend any new and interesting philosophical works or ideas to check out? Well, so new is relative to all of us, right? What's kind of cool about philosophy is you can always find new works without having to necessarily go and find the newest thing out there because philosophy's got such a massive catalog of works, even just in Western philosophy, you know, not to speak of these other vast philosophical traditions that are available to us. So um, I mean, I don't know what's new to you, so I don't have anything to say about that. Um, Actually, I mean, a lot of what I'm doing these days is rereading. Um, I don't know if there are any like works right now on the horizon for me in philosophy that are new, as in like I haven't read them that I plan to read, but there are quite a few works in speculative fiction. I mean, there are things like so friend and colleague of mine published this recently and sent me a copy, Tim Laban, and I haven't read my way through it yet. I've got one entry in here, and so there's a lot of new stuff like that. But it's about Stoicism, so that's not radically new. So yeah, I think I kind of punted that question there. All right, let's see what else we have here. Oh, a lot of questions piling up. Um, Emergence as a means of participation. You've mentioned an interest in doing a retrospective on the value of 20th century continental philosophers. What are a couple of the insights you think are particularly valuable from that period? Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I just thought of doing 20th century. I mean, there's 19th century thinkers as well. And I mean, I've actually thought about doing a short book, um, sort of a critical evaluation of Hegel, like what Hegel got right, because there's an awful lot that Hegel got wrong. What can we draw from his ideas? And I think the notion of recognition is absolutely central for that. But if we're thinking about 20th century thinkers, um, so like Derrida, for example, there's an awful lot of silly joking around and showing off and stuff like that, and some things that I think are just wrong in Derrida's work. But this notion, rightly interpreted, of there's nothing outside of the text. There, yin yang or text. There isn't an outside of textuality. I think that's actually quite correct. It doesn't mean that everything's a text, but it means that you can't ever get completely away from it. Or Gilles Deleuze's discussions of the function of law in some of his later works, like in Critique et Clinique. Um, I think that's a good set of realizations. Heidegger obviously has a lot of cool things to contribute, as do um, Gabriel Marcel and uh, Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus and all these people that we typically talk about as existentialists. Um, I like Habermas's discourse ethics and the idea that we should try to work out consensus on important matters together. So those are some interesting points, you could say, and we'll see how much progress I ever make on this. The bicameral monk. Oh, here's an easy one for me to answer. What is your favorite Dostoevsky book? The one that's translated the title either as the demons or the possessed. That's my favorite. A lot of people want to wade their way through Brothers Karamazov as if like that's the big achievement. I actually found large parts of Brothers Karamazov kind of, I won't say boring, but you know, making me say, "Why the hell am I reading this when I could be reading something else?" Um, the Idiot. It's been a long time since I read it, but I kind of felt like I never got the point of it. Crime and Punishment is okay, Obviously, um, uh, Notes from the Underground is great, but the Demons just has, for me, it's like the best developed Dostoevsky novel. So that's the one I prefer. Um, Sayed says, I started working through Lacan's seminars, and I often struggle to fully comprehend what he's trying to say. Do you have any tips for tackling his corpus fruitfully? Yeah, I mean, I would say you're probably not going to understand necessarily everything that he's saying unless you're putting an awful lot of time into it. And Lacan is one of those people where, so there's two things to say. One is that he's unnecessarily, like Derrida, he's unnecessarily um, complex and precious in the way that he writes, and that's sort of like um, past the World War II French prose in philosophy. There's an awful lot of cleverness there that doesn't need to be there. That I think people eventually, like 100 years, 200 years from now, there'll be some people who like that, and a lot of people will be like, you just got to like get through that stuff. The other thing is, I mean, sometimes Lacan is just kind of experimenting, and you know, he'll go down a blind alley, and like everybody else, he hasn't read everybody. He's got opinions on all sorts of things. He can be wrong about stuff. So I would say if you feel like you can at least tell yourself, I think here's what's going on, you're probably doing okay with him. I don't have any like great tips for reading his stuff. I mean, you could say this, that Lacan is not just farting around for the sake of farting around. He actually sooner or later has to like make people's lives somewhat better. Not cure them, but at least improve their lives and give them a bit more autonomy in deciding what they're going to do, and insight and stuff like that. So, all right, Arcturus, I've heard you refer to a category of French reflexive philosophy, but couldn't find anything when looking it up. So, would you please refer to the main figures in this movement? Well, I mean, it's not hard to find, so I'm not sure where you were looking it up, but it's not a category. It's just sort of a designation. And I think you should be able to find stuff online about it pretty easily. Maurice Blondel is, a reflexive philosopher. I think you could say that Gabriel Marcel is as well. Um, Jacques Pagliar is a good example, and it's not a movement per se where there was like a manifesto or anything. It's just kind of a way of doing philosophy where you're paying attention to how the mind is indeed reflexive, and not just the intellect but the will and things like that. So um but I think if you type in, in quotes, reflexive philosophy French, I would bet you there's going to be some stuff that would come up on Google lickety split. As a matter of fact, let's make an experiment. Reflexive philosophy. Let's just see what comes up with reflex. Well, first thing that comes up, Paul Ricoeur, right? And so the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. His early academic training was in the tradition of reflexive philosophy, right? So it's not like um, if you search, you're not going to find stuff coming up right away. So, all right. Alexander, do you have an opinion on philosophers like Nick Bostrom and William McCaskill or effective altruism, long termism generally? I haven't read Bostrom or McCaskill. Effective altruism. I mean, the person that most familiar with is Singer, right? Who and effective altruism and utilitarianism have a lot of overlap. They're not exactly the same, but close enough, I think, in many respects. Um, I mean, I think that there's a lot of good points to it. I think that with utilitarianism, there's a lot of good points to it. I don't buy into it as an overall um, guiding philosophy for everything the way some people do. But then again, I'm not a movement joiner. you know? I think a lot of people need to have something that they feel is like grounding everything for them. Um, Interestingly, we're discussing effective altruism in connection with utilitarianism in my philosophy, mindfulness, and life class at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design this semester, which I need to get my butt in gear because I haven't opened the class yet for my students. All right, Patrick, I've heard you mention once that you're a Catholic. What do you think is the best reason to believe in the Christian God? I grew up Catholic, but I have become more agnostic over time. I don't think there's a best reason. I think that I kind of agree with William James when it comes to this sort of stuff, and you know, also Pascal and Maurice Blondel and people like that. There isn't a best reason. There's a whole bunch of different things that we can decide whether they count as reasons for us. And sometimes we are in a situation where we are unable to see these things as good reasons, and that could be a failure on our part or on culture that we've absorbed or stuff like that. But typically, when people aren't converted or reinforced in their faith by traditional apologetics. I'm always very suspicious of people who are big on apologetics because I tend to think that there's an awful lot of emotional stuff going on under the surface that is unacknowledged there. And same thing, by the way, for apologetics for atheism. There's an awful lot of atheists whose position is essentially just emotionally driven too. So I tend to think that you want to know about a religion, well, you study its key texts and then you see what its great thinkers have had to contribute and you see how people live that way and what it contributes to their life and you kind of experiment with it. So if you're Catholic, maybe you say the Liturgy of the Hours and you see whether that has any interesting effects on you, or you take Anselm's Proslogion and use it the way it was originally intended to, not as a philosophy of religion, argument in week 4 of the class, but rather as a meditation or something like that. So, all right. Getting asked about a lot of people I don't know. Francesco says, "Have you ever heard of the philosopher from southern Italy called Pasquale Galuppi?" No, I have never heard of him. But that doesn't mean anything about the quality of people. There's probably tens of thousands of philosophers I've never heard of. Um, Valuska says, I wanted to ask you a very general question. How do you find yourself interested in a certain philosophy? Like, what motivates you one day to go read Hegel or Epicurus? Well, nothing motivates me one day to go read them. It's usually that like something led to something else, led to something else. And I'm actually, I'm not a good person to ask about that because I've been reading and studying philosophy now for over 3 decades, so I'm probably closer to the end of my studies because I could die before I reach 82 than I am to the start of it. And a lot of philosophers, I encountered at one point, and I was like, oh, maybe I should go back and check that stuff out. Or it's somebody references them, and I'm like, maybe there's something more there I should go read. So, all right. T. Douglas says, I'm a high school senior in Canada. An idea been floating around with my friends is starting a philosophical journal. Got any advice? Yeah, don't make it a print journal, make it online, because printing, costs money, right? And there's all sorts of things involved with it. I actually started a journal at one point in time, and it was a complete flop. That was, well, over 20 years ago. Um, it's an awful lot of work to keep a journal going. Well, a lot of people will say they're going to do something and then they don't do it. I'll write a book review for you, and then they take the book and they don't write it. You got to, you know, it's a lot of hassles. Um and the other bit of advice that I would give you would be maybe get yourself involved with some other journals. Maybe you've already done this, but get yourself on, the editorial board, or be a reviewer or something like that for journals, and then you get to see some of how the proverbial sausage is made, and that will help you when you decide to start your own journal later on down the line. um, so Cola asks, have you seen any thought-provoking films recently? I don't think I've watched a full-length movie for quite a while. Um, my viewing is mainly watching shows with my wife or watching shows on my own, which is typically as I'm going to sleep. So like I've been rewatching Red Dwarf, which is good fun sci-fi. Definitely not hard sci-fi, but a funny character-oriented sci-fi show from uh, Britain from the 1980s, maybe going into the 90s. Um, yeah, so I haven't watched any movies lately, so I don't have any material there to recommend. Um, Alexander says, "Do you think it's useful to group philosophers like Alistair MacIntyre, Charles Taylor, and Michael Sandel together under the communitarian label?" I mean, I've never found it useful myself because when I look at, and I'm familiar with all three of them, much more with McIntyre's work than Taylor's or Sandel, but they were all like big names back in the 90s when I was coming up in grad school. I've never really enjoyed reading Charles Taylor, and so that's kind of an impediment, whereas I do enjoy reading Sandel and McIntyre. Um, and I find some of Taylor's assertions, like, interiority begins with Augustine. That's crazy nonsense that, shows that a lack of engagement with sufficient pre-Christian and, early Christian philosophy. Um, I mean, I think when it comes to these labels, you got to ask, well, what work is the label doing? Are you using the label so that you can identify certain traits that you think these philosophers have in common, or so you can predict what they're going to say next without actually having to read what they say on particular things? I mean, there's a lot of places where Sandel and McIntyre and Taylor are not going to be on the same page. Um, so I don't know how helpful it is. And communitarian, there's not a lot of like real substantive discussion of that these days in political philosophy, as far as I can tell. Yeah, maybe I'm misinformed, but yeah. All right. Let's see here. June says, new to your AMA, wanted to ask MA philosophy or MPhil for legal scholarship and energy justice. I don't have a clue. I mean, that would be something that you'd want to ask people who work in those fields, you know? And when it comes to like thinking about programs, you got to look at each individual program as its own separate animal. It's not as if there's like a standard MA in philosophy, right? It's going to vary from school to school to school. Jordan, you've alluded to the difficulties of being a first generation academic. How do you deal with going from the military to academia? Was it a rough transition or were you into philosophy during your time in? I mean, none of those really apply. I mean, I didn't go straight from the military into academia. What I did was I got out in March of 1990, and I moved back in with my mom in Waukesha, and I did what I did before, which is work in restaurants. I literally just walked down Highway 18 and put in job applications at the places that were within walking distance nearby, except for Ponderosa, where I'd already worked and knew I didn't want to go back to, and Shakey's Pizza. I've done a video about Shakey's Pizza, by the way. Shakey's Pizza got back to me and they're like, "Hey, you want to come in and do prep?" And and then I bartended there for a while, and I cooked and dishwashed and did all the. I actually went on deliveries as well. And after a while, I was like, man, this sucks. Maybe I should go to college. But I had no intention of going into academia. Going to college and going into academia, two totally different things, right? The one, going to college, is one of the many prerequisites for the other. But I had no idea that I was going to go to grad school or anything like that. And I knew a little bit of philosophy. Man, I've talked about this at other places. I had some philosophy stuff in high school. My actual philosophy class sucked. The class that I learned real philosophy in was a sacraments class where the teacher, who was a substitute, just happened to teach us about Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and stuff like that. And then I probably read a book about philosophy that I bought at the PX while I was in the army, but I wasn't like studying it. So, I got to college in fall of 1990, and things just kind of fell into place. I had high test scores, so they gave me some financial aid, and they put me in the French house because they knew that I was from a francophone family, and they were trying out this new experimental thing. And then I took some philosophy classes and also math classes, and had majors in both of those, but I was doing a lot of stuff with art. I worked for the art department as a carpenter and docent and model, and I was playing my bass, and doing music stuff and a lot of partying. So it's not like at that time I was like, yes, I'm going to be a professor. I mean, I never intended to go to college in the first place. And then when I did, I didn't go to the right place or study things in the right way. I just kind of studied whatever the hell I wanted to, and my professors in philosophy kind of sucked, you know. And then I got done there, and I came down here to Milwaukee and lived here for a year, just working as a third shift security guard. And, I'd read some philosophical literature. Like I worked my way through being and nothingness again in a serious way, and studied languages. And then, at the end of that, went off to Quebec and to Europe for like a summer, and then went right into grad school at Southern Illinois, Carbondale. Which again, if I'd known anything about how the game works in philosophy, I would have probably gone to some of the other schools that accepted me and applied to different schools. But you just don't know, right? So the military thing had nothing to do with that, other than like there's some things that you never really lose, like walking at 120 steps per minute, like marching, or um, a certain predilection for cleanliness. So yeah. So it wasn't I mean, actually being in the military probably made it easier for me to be able to indulge myself and yet have the discipline to keep myself on track in school, you know? Um, but yeah, that's probably, all I have to say about that. All right, Elijah says, "I am considering a career in law. Any advice on how to decide whether to pursue a career in law? I also have the opportunity to attend medical school and need to decide between the 2." There's a couple things you could do. You could look at I mean, first off, you should be talking with doctors and lawyers about the kind of work that they're doing, and what they think sucks about it and what the prospects are for their jobs going forward, you know? Um, that'd be much more helpful than talking to a philosopher. And, you want to try to look at whatever information you can find about what the likelihood of making a decent living and having a good, lifestyle that you want to have 10, 20, 30 years down the line in these fields. I mean, there's areas where AI is projected to make some pretty serious inroads into how things are done in law and medicine. So you want to be attentive to those sort of things and look at the rigors that are required for the years that you're in it. I mean, law school, basically you got 3 years, study for the bar, pass the bar, right? And then you got to work for people, right? So there's something kind of like a residency, but they're not going to make you partner right away, right? Medical school, you've got pre-med and then you go to med school and then you're a doctor, but you have to be a resident and being a resident sucks, right? And then you get out and you get to do it, whatever it is that you're going to do. So I think those are all things that you would want to take into consideration in making that decision. Um, Zeno says, what do you think of Zero Books publication? Um, The Dust of This Planet, Eugene Thacker is one of them. You know, I haven't paid that close attention to what's been happening at Zero Books. I know there was a lot of um, having to do with Doug Lane a while back, like some controversy, but I didn't really pay close attention to it. I admittedly don't read Zero Books much. I mean, I can't say that I've read any of their books. I've paged through a few, um, but I'm not really connected with them, so I don't really have much to say about them. Damon Forbes, anything on Charles Bukowski and existentialism seems to me is the American Dostoevsky. I'm not impressed with Bukowski, and maybe I need to give him a reread. Um, he always struck me as being sort of like a knockoff Norman Mailer, just a little bit more tawdry. And the other thing that kind of turned me off is like every dirtbag who had literary pretensions back in the '90s was a Bukowski fan. Sort of like how you get like the David Foster Wallace fan club every once in a while coming up as well. And I'm not really into that kind of stuff. I mean, Bukowski, um, he lived a certain kind of lifestyle, which I guess you could say intersected with the lifestyle I lived at certain points. Um, Although it wasn't identical with it. And I always just found him kind of, you know, tendentious. So I don't really have a lot of good to say about him, quite frankly. Um, There's a question here. Could you please share your opinion of Hayden White's philosophy of history? I don't have an opinion on Hayden White's philosophy of history. I'm getting asked about a lot of people who I don't really read. Alexander, who, in your opinion, are the most overrated philosophers? Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, you know, this is going to seem really a weird one. Ayn Rand, right? Because the people who are really into Ayn Rand think that like she is the best thing since sliced bread. And she is a philosopher. Academics who, oh, she's not a philosopher. They're actually being elitist and full of crap. But she's like a third-rate philosopher who is really awful when it comes to interpretations of the people she likes and dislikes. Like you can't go to Rand for any genuine interpretation of Kant or Plato or Nietzsche, and you also can't go to Kant to her for any interpretation of Aristotle, because even though she loves him, she loves somebody who's not really Aristotle, which, by the way, she has in common with many Thomists as well, who are, kind of piss poor readers of Aristotle and sometimes even of Thomas Aquinas. Um, so, the popularity that she has, the general popularity over here, makes her kind of overrated, but not for a lot of the people in the academy. In the academy, I mean, yeah, who should we think of? That's a good question, because there aren't that many philosophers who are actually held in really high esteem. There's a lot of pseudo philosophers, right? There's like the whole tier of gurus, people that are part of the popular culture and they're kind of occupying the space that good philosophers should occupy, like Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris or Jonathan Haidt, or all these public intellectuals whose work is, often you read it and you're like, this is kind of sloppy crap. Um, but that's sort of shooting fish in a barrel. Actual philosophers who are overrated. That's a good question. Um, I mean, I think it depends on where you are, because you can go into a discourse where people are like, you've got to read this person or else you're not really in touch with philosophy. And anytime somebody says something like that, you can be like, yeah, I think we were doing philosophy before they came on the scene, and we'll probably still be doing it even if we haven't read them. So, in certain areas, like the latest analytic darling or continental darling, or pick whatever else you want, would kind of fit in with that. But I think it would have to be according to like what place people are looking at. I did this thing about texts with auras, quick takes, and all of them, except for Nick Land, of course, who I don't think particularly highly of. But I also don't think is the stuff in Fang Newman, I don't think is crap. I think some of his later stuff is pretty crappy. Um, all the other people like, Benedict Spinoza or Derrida or people like that, they're good philosophers. They're not overrated, but there's a lot of people out there talking about them without having spent much time with the texts, who like talk them up to the skies, and so they could be overrated in that sense, right? All right, Gilgamesh says, I've got some confidence and anxiety issues when I socialize. I'm very self conscious. Do you know any thinkers who've had the same issues or at least wrote about confidence? Yeah, there's lots of thinkers who've written about confidence, and many people have had those sorts of um, affects and worries, including myself. Um, when I was younger, I had this thing where I felt like I was always being watched, and so I need to like make sure that my behavior was the right sort and all that. And it was so liberating to realize that most people don't pay attention to most of what's going on around them most of the time. Um, and there's lots of different, causes and modalities of anxiety that can arise. I mean, the Stoics are particularly good for that. I mean, Epictetus actually has all sorts of discussions about fears and anxiety and what it is that we're actually worried about, and thinking these things through, and how to have confidence, what to be confident about. A lot of this winds up being a matter of changing your mindset through experimentation and practice, and like reminding yourself of things over and over again. And it might be helpful to like do this with other people, like a therapist or a coach or support group or um, friends who are interested in that sort of thing as well. All right, Dr. G. Boss, I've been thinking about deception from a philosophical point of view. Would like to know if there's any texts on this. Lots of texts. Yeah, I mean, Augustine comes to mind. He's actually got two different treatises on lying. You know, As a matter of fact, you could go to um, Cicely Bach's famous book, "Lying," and look at the bibliography that she has in the back of it and take off from there. There's lots and lots and lots of references to deception and lying. I mean, think about Plato's allegory of the cave, right? So there's probably too many to count up. And you could distinguish between modalities like deceiving but not lying, lying, creating situations of deception, being deceived oneself. But there's I mean, it's been Heraclitus talks about it, right? The majority of human beings don't know what the hell they're doing. They're all mixed up about stuff, right? So AOC time. Okay, here we go. Hope you're having a wonderful new year. In your personal experience, what is something that all outstanding student papers have, assuming there is such a thing? I don't think there is such a thing. I mean, other than being excellent, right? Which doesn't help us out at all. That's if we want to figure it out. I mean, that's an interesting question because um, excellent student papers are often excellent for different reasons, right? And I mean, we could say some generic things like, well, they exceed expectations. They're better than the usual paper, but that's all kind of relative, isn't it, to the expectations or how everybody else is doing. I mean, what I really like to see is serious engagement with whatever it is that we're studying and the student having done work on their own. And I also like, and this is not universal, right? But I like to see a student looking at the same thing from multiple points of view and figuring out why one point of view is better than the others, at least at that point in time for them, right? So all right, Maximum. What do you think is the best Hegel book to get started with Hegel? Well, it's going to be a book by Hegel, not a book on Hegel, because I think you should actually make a stab at primary texts. I recommend not starting with the phenomenology. My consistent recommendation is that you start with the lectures on the philosophy of history or the lectures on the history of philosophy because they're easier, a bit more, naming names, telling you who the hell he's talking about, whereas the phenomenology, and you could also say this about the logic and even philosophy of right, which are like the masterworks, there's not a lot of, you have to do a lot of like figuring out who the hell is he talking about here, right? Um, but those lectures are easier to make your way into. I mean, some people like to start people off with reason and history, which is not bad. I guess that's not a terrible way to go. But yeah, that's maybe the way to do things. Um, Here's another one from I can't read Cyrillic stuff, so I'm not going to try to pronounce this. Could you give any recommendations on the postdocs for philosophy, political theory in the US and Canada? I'm finishing my PhD in September, so I'm trying to get information on that matter. I cannot give you any information on that matter because it's not something that I do any work on. I can say this that, just like every department is its own animal, every postdoc is its own animal. And you want to go to people that are closer to that particular thing that you're applying for. Um, so all right. Somebody's got what I think is Arabic here. How to remember what you've read? I don't know. Different people use different things. I don't really rely on mnemonic devices. I've been fortunate in that I was blessed with a pretty decent memory and I connect things up together, but sometimes I forget things as well. I don't worry too much about it at this point in my career. Um, but I can tell you, like when I was learning languages, lots and lots and lots of drills, actually using what it is that you're working with. When I was memorizing things for the uh, tests that I had to take at the master's and PhD level, going over the material over and over again and making notes and diagrams for myself that I found helpful were what I did, but other people did other things. All right. TL Stock says, I appreciate your work. I was first introduced to existentialism via Walker Percy and haven't looked back since. Oh, well, okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess he's considered an American existentialist. So, yeah. Um, Francesco says, for you, is Jorge Luis Borges closer to speculative fiction than he is to magical realism? So that's a category mistake. Magical realism is a kind of speculative fiction. There's all different kinds of speculative fiction. Think of speculative fiction as being like the super category, the super genre that has a whole bunch of different genres underneath it, which include magical realism and include fantasy, science fiction, horror, weird, superhero, alternate history, utopian, dystopian. All of those are speculative fiction. So that means that speculative fiction as a category is not super helpful, right? Um, Borges is very, very philosophically oriented when you look at his stuff. Um, I mean, there are some stories where there's not any explicit reference to philosophy as such, but there are quite a few where there is. So um, you could say either of those fit in there. And you ask about Alejo Carpentier. I have no idea who that is. Macedonia Fernandez. Macedonia Fernandez never wrote anything apparently. So all we know is like what people have said about him. And Salman Rushdie, I don't know about Rushdie because I don't read him. So I don't read a lot of 20th century, 21st century modernist stuff. I'm not well read in those sorts of things. In part because you got 24 hours a day. How much are you going to spend on these big names, as opposed to other stuff? Anthony Loreno, thoughts on Jonathan Haidt? I don't take him very seriously. He likes to get dichotomies that, in my view, are kind of sloppy and don't hold up. And I think he kind of brings discredit on his profession in some of the stuff that he says. Um, Lord Roku, how familiar are you with theology and current academia? What's your take on it? Theology, like philosophy, is an incredibly vast spectrum. So there is no such thing as theology in current academia. There's all sorts of theological approaches and traditions and schools and questions and stuff like that. Nobody, nobody out there is conversant with all of it. It's just impossible, just like it would be impossible to do for philosophy. So I don't really have a take on theology in current academia because I mean it's sort of like trying to say something about you know an island chain and the tendency is to focus in on one or two islands rather than on the other 200 or so that are out there. Stoic Shravan, have you read ancient Hindu philosophy? Yeah, I mean, I've even taught classes on non-Western philosophy and religion, but I'm not an expert on it, and I don't read Sanskrit. So I generally leave the doing videos and stuff like that about that to people who actually can do that. Same thing with ancient Chinese philosophy, right? I don't read more than a few characters in Mandarin. Well, in Chinese, the dialect that I can speak a little bit of is Mandarin, and that's the contemporary stuff, not classical Chinese. So I leave that to the other people who are better experts on that. Max says, would like to thank you for the Anselm core concept vids, going through the monologian and finding his approach and ideas on how God works. That's a good way to put it, how God works. And at least what we can figure out about how God works. Fascinating. Yeah, that's pretty good. Anselm is a unusual thinker, you know. There's going to be a podcast episode because I did an interview recently. The hell is, I can't remember the name of the podcast. It's an Irish guy who was interviewing me. That'll be coming out recently, or it'll be coming out soon, about Anselm and his approach, and we talk about the proslogian and monologian. We don't get into the other works. Pat, what's your favorite period of Western art? I mean, I don't know that I have one. I think if you would have asked me back when I was like a college student, I would have said like the Impressionists, but I don't know that I actually have favorites these days when it comes to that sort of thing. I mean, I love going to museums, and I also love working in a place like Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, where every floor is filled with student and sometimes faculty art and alumni art. And then the basement has two galleries that there's exhibitions in all the time as well. We're really quite fortunate living where we do here in Milwaukee. We've also got the St. Kate's Art Hotel. We've got this amazing art museum just a mile and a half down the road from us. So I don't really have favorites like that. Um, Communizer Hegel once said, "You're either a Spinozist or not a philosopher at all." What are some ways Spinoza influenced Hegel's thought? I would say not for the best. Um, And people love slogans and stuff like that, but a lot of that stuff is kind of silly, and this is in the category of the silly. Um, a lot of those German idealists were attracted to Spinoza's pantheism, and you could call it a rejection, but let's call it a reinterpretation of teleology. But if you look at what Hegel's doing and then you map it on to Spinoza, Spinoza looks pretty poor in comparison, even as wrong as Hegel is on a lot of things, like the nature of history and its end. He at least has stuff about history, and Spinoza doesn't. I mean, Spinoza kind of does in the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, but not in the ethics, right? Um, so, I mean, I don't take those sorts of quips very seriously. They're certainly not something I would use to orient my thought. Yannick says, after studying Plato's works by myself, I'm unsure about how to move on. Which philosopher would you recommend as the second step on my self study journey? Well, I mean, you can pick whoever you want. You could, if you like the character of Socrates, why not read some Xenophon, another student of Socrates. It won't take you as long to read as Plato because we don't have as much by Xenophon. And you could maybe skip some of the stuff that doesn't have to do with Socrates, like the Anabasis, the March Up, or the Education of Cyrus, or you could read that stuff. Or you could read Aristotle. I mean, that's kind of a natural way to go. Or you could look at the things that we have of these minor Socratic schools, like the Cyrenaics, so that won't take you long, or the Cynics. There's all sorts of ways you could go. You could also like jump way ahead and read middle Platonists like Plutarch and Alcinous, or read later Platonists. It's up to you. There's nobody who's behind you who's gonna wrap your hand if you read the wrong person next. So all right. Patrick, could you recommend three books to start with to better understand Christian thought? Yeah, I mean, if you want to um understand where stuff is coming from, obviously you have to read the Gospels, right? Because these are where we're getting the story of this Jesus guy from in really important determinative ways. Um, and it all depends on what you're looking for. I mean, do you want to like try to read some of the greatest ideas by the greatest thinkers? Do you want to read contemporary stuff? Do you want to read the earliest Christian philosophers? I mean, Justin Martyr would be somebody, or Lactantius would be somebody that you'd want to read then. um, there's all different sort of options, and I'll tell you this. This might be an interesting answer to your question. So Paul Griffiths, great Augustine scholar, guy who was a Buddhist for a long time, from England, studied here in Wisconsin at UW Wisconsin Madison. Bumped all around. I think his last teaching appointment was at Duke, but I think he's emeritus from there now. um, at the University of Illinois at Chicago, back in the days when he and I used to correspond, um, he taught a class and it was called like Introduction to Catholicism, right? And the three books that he used for that were Augustine's Confessions, portions of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia, and Pascal's Pensées. Kind of an interesting approach, isn't it? You know? I mean, I'm not sure that I would necessarily have picked those 3 myself, but they're certainly up there, you know? So, I think that's quite good. All right, emergence as a means of participation. Any recommendations for editions of Gabriel Marcel's works in English? Yeah, whatever you can get. I mean, I don't know that there's, like, multiple translations. You just Google Gabriel Marcel and go to Amazon, and you'll see a ton of his books come up. Like, for example, the Homo Viator, right? So, the translation of this, translated by Emma Crawford and Paul Seaton, it's probably the only translation out there. I don't think you need to worry about editions. Just get your hands on some, and you don't necessarily even need to buy them. You could probably find them at your local library, at least some of them. So, all right, Nick Alanto. I'm wondering if you're going to make videos about analytic philosophy. I've already made lots of videos about analytic philosophy. I mean, if you know what analytic philosophy is and who the people involved in the movement are, all you got to do is look at the numerous core concept videos that I've done on analytic thinkers and question answered, right? Communizer, have you read any Carl Schmidt? I remember in one of your book tour videos, you have some of Angerman's works. Yeah, I mean, I think everybody back in the day read some Carl Schmidt, and he's okay, but he's not, awesome. And Agamben is, okay, but not like awesome. So sure. Um, all right, let's see what else we have here. Joseph says, how can we connect the dots between ancient philosophical tradition versus modern? Do they complement or are they opposed? So you're not going to like what I have to say, which is that there's no such thing as ancient philosophical tradition or modern philosophical tradition. They are both plural. And the way you connect the dots is by actually reading the philosophers and seeing who the hell they talk about. I mean, this is pretty straightforward. You read Descartes, and you can be pretty clear that he's taking some stuff from the Stoics, who were quite popular at the time that he's writing, right? Or you read David Hume, and you see the many references that he makes to ancient thinkers. He's even got essays, the Platonist, the Epicurean, the Stoic, the Skeptic. So that, I mean, that kind of tells you about these, not tradition, but traditions of ancient philosophy, right? Which were being talked about in the modern period. So you want to avoid schematic treatments of things, right? So wherever you got the idea that there's an ancient philosophical tradition, singular, whoever told you that, get rid of them because they're full of crap. You know, spend your time actually reading ancient philosophy, in multiple traditions, and you'll get a really good sense of what's going on. Um, Pat says, "How would you define who is a philosopher versus a rhetorician, pop philosopher?" I don't define, so that's kind of a non-starter there. What are borderline examples like JBP, Camus, Lewis, Dante, Hawking, etc.? Well, Camus is a philosopher. Camus is not a pop philosopher. He's not a rhetorician. Camus is a hardcore philosopher. Read The Rebel, and you'll see that. JBP. Is that Peterson's middle name? Peterson's not a philosopher. He's a psychologist and kind of a, you know, kind of a bullshitter. Lewis, you probably mean C.S. Lewis, not David Lewis, right? Because I was kind of thinking about that. David Lewis, the possible worlds guy, really set the agenda for a lot of analytic philosophy for about 2 decades, uh, giving some important vocabulary. C.S. Lewis, um, not just a rhetorician, he's definitely within the scope of philosophy. Hawking is kind of a weird guy because I don't think he's actually studied enough philosophy to opine about philosophy. But I don't worry about defining this. I don't worry about drawing the line. What I worry about is reading enough good stuff so that you can like sort of like listening to enough good music where you can be like, that stuff over there is not very good, right? Metaphysics. How can studying logic and philosophy benefit us? I mean, those are two different topics, right? So, studying logic, just like studying mathematics, helps to, build certain habits of mind, but it's not always directly applicable to life. And there's kind of a mistaken attitude that people have, like, oh, I can put everything into syllogisms. Studying philosophy, much broader topic. I mean, a lot of philosophy is practical philosophy. So, how can studying Stoicism or Epicureanism or other philosophies of life help you by helping you figure out how to run your life? Right? I mean, that's pretty straightforward. So, yeah. Um, Jordan says, "Do you have an opinion on dialechistic logics where contradictions can be true? Do you think those sort of systems can be truth tracking? They feel broken to me, but I'm not very good at logic." Do I have an opinion on that? I don't have an opinion on that. No. Um, I will say this, that and we're talking essentially in the field of formal logic, right? We're not talking about other logics in which contradictions can be true, like Hegelian logic or Maurice Blondel's logic of the moral life, or all these other things that we can talk about as well. They're not as easily mapped onto that. You can't really formalize Hegel's ideas, um, but no, I don't really have opinions on those sorts of things. Um, Zach says, any advice on building your first philosophy class, building one now? Well, that depends on what kind of philosophy class you're building. Obviously, intro is different than ethics, is different than, logic or whatever other thing you've been assigned. I actually do have some useful advice. Don't try to do too much. It's tempting, especially like in an intro class, to throw way, way too much material at the students. And then you find that they're lost and frustrated, and they're not retaining much from week to week, or let alone from semester to semester. So figure out a couple themes that you can bring up over and over again, and make sure to draw the connections out for them. And the other thing I would say is, put the bar for your expectations kind of low. I mean, this pertains more to like the American setting, because I don't know where you are. You could be in a place where maybe students have had some philosophy, but you know, a lot of students don't have any clue what philosophy is, or what a philosophy class is going to be like, and they come in kind of anxious about that. So, you don't want them to be stifled or made too rigid by that. Um, so you want to try to put them at ease, and you can tell them things like, there isn't a definition of philosophy, or one single way to do it. It's a pluralistic sort of discipline. Saeed says, so here's the opposite side of it. Any tips for an unmotivated student? Um, I mean, it all depends on why you're unmotivated, doesn't it? If I mean, sometimes people go to school and it's not the right time for them. Like, I know if I had gone right into college, right out of high school, I probably would have dropped out of college. Um, it wasn't the right time for me. And I teach. I'm gesturing that way because I'm thinking about Marquette University, which is 12 blocks that way. Sometimes I see these students and they're in college because of other people's expectations, and it's tough for them to stay motivated because of that, right? Because they're not really into what they're supposed to be doing. So if that's the case, you might want to think about whether it's a good time to be in school, whether you're getting something out of it. It could also be like, you made some progress and then you just kind of got burnt out. You need to figure out how to revitalize yourself and, what to do. So I don't have any real generic advice there to give. All right. Min G, been a subscriber for years since I took Intro to Philosophy, going through your half hour Hegel to be more erudite. Thank you for what you do. Go Evil Sadler. Yeah, we'll see Evil Sadler show up maybe later on this month. Um, I mean, if the goal is to be erudite, I don't know that Hegel is the best person to be tackling. Somebody like Plato or Cicero or Augustine, somebody who's much more rhetorically oriented, or Nietzsche, right? Um, Hegel, to try to read Hegel's a terrible writer, and you definitely don't want to imitate his style. And a lot of his stuff is kind of muddy. Um, and he often, like I mentioned, he often doesn't tell you who the hell he's talking about. He doesn't quote texts except in lectures. So, I mean, studying Hegel is not going to hurt you, but there may be more direct ways to become more erudite. Um, Akram, if the Abrahamic religions are going to transform themselves in the future, which way do you think it's going to be? Oh, I don't know. I mean, usually we're talking about like Judaism and Christianity and Islam, and we could kind of include some others in there as well. And I mean, look at Christianity; it's such a hot mess with so many different things going on, even within the same denomination or church or something like that. I don't have a clue where they're going to go. So, Ricardo, which top five philosophers make you feel like you just read straight heat? I don't know. I don't know what reading straight heat means. It must be a contemporary term that people use that I just didn't get. Um, I mean, I'll just say that the people that I find most exciting to read, um, Lev Shestov, you know, Nietzsche. He's always worth going back to. Shestov, of course, is drawing on Nietzsche pretty heavily. Um, Kind of like David Hume. Um, Epictetus is pretty cool. And who else would I throw in there? Um, where you get real excited reading them. That's a good question. I mean, I don't get like all jazzed up that much. The fire thing, I'm not quite sure what that would look like. All right, Ken says, unfortunately, I know very little classical Latin. Is there a particular translation of Cicero you would recommend? Well, Cicero's written a whole bunch of books, so there isn't a translation of all of his stuff. There's different translations out there for the different works. Um, I mean, the Loeb editions, I like those because um, you've got the Latin on the facing page, so you can always, go back and forth. But those are usually older translations. Um, Cambridge has brought out a bunch of Cicero translations in recent years that have become, if I'm right about this, they've become kind of standard use in academic settings. So yeah. Um, all right. Well, yeah, I don't have much to say about that. Mark, who can we turn to help us understand the current political climate that's been developing over the last decade in the United States? Well, that's an interesting one because there's a lot of not exactly like history repeating itself, but there's interesting correspondences. We're seeing the rise of new forms of fascism, and it goes under different words, sometimes using the same word, like integralism, right? In Catholic circles, and this has been done before. You can look at French thought in the 20th century and see the same sort of bullshit being bandied around by Steve Bannon looks like a fatter and less well put together Charles Marat, the guy who helped found Action Française, the movement that was eventually condemned actually by the Vatican, but drew a lot of conservative Catholics into it in the aughts and teens and 20s in French thought. Um, William Shirer's Decline and Fall of the French Third Republic is worth reading because of some of the parallels that you can see going on. But we're also in a new situation. I mean, I don't think that there is a analysis out there that neatly distinguishes how screwed up our beloved constitutional republic is. Our constitution and our arrangements for things are clearly antiquated, and all sorts of openings and holes in them for abuse. So I don't know. There's no like one thinker who I would say helps us understand all of that. We have to look at multiple analyses. Snake asks about Ayn Rand. I talked about Ayn Rand earlier in it. Said says, our professor once said Nietzsche's a pseudo philosopher. What do you think about that? I'm sure your professor has their reasons for saying that, and I'm sure that they're bad reasons. So I mean, Nietzsche's clearly a major philosopher, and the inability to appreciate, even if you disagree with him, what Nietzsche's up to, and the need to call him a pseudo philosopher, I would say reflects badly on your professor. Um, Danny, how would you respond to refute Descartes' evil demon hypothesis? How would you refute the simulation hypothesis? I don't see a need to refute the simulation hypothesis. I think that the burden of proof falls on the simulation people. The evil demon hypothesis, I mean, you could go Descartes' route, right? And I just happen to have the meditations right here. Um, how does Descartes do it? You know, how do other people do it? You know, can you actually doubt everything? Uh, Hume thinks you can't. Peirce thinks you can't. So I'd read these thinkers who actually engage that. I don't. How would I respond? I don't, because it's not really a worry for me. Jordan, would you consider G.K. Chesterton a philosopher? He wasn't formally trained, and his work is often apologetical, but it shocks me as the philosophical instincts he has without any formal education. He had plenty of formal education. You don't have to have, I mean, back then, people read books, and there was a general culture that you could participate in, and it included a lot of philosophy. So, You don't have to go to study in a philosophy program to be a uh, well versed in philosophy. Is he a philosopher? Depends on how we define philosopher, right? I would say we can call him that in a broad sense. And I don't think that a lot of his work is actually apologetic. A lot of his work is essays and short stories and novels, Um, some stuff that he writes. I mean, I'll put it to you this way. If you want to call things like the everlasting man apologetic, it's apologetic in a way that's not boring and kind of schematic the way that most apologetics tends to be, you know. But Chesterton also knows that people aren't convinced solely by a rational argument or something like that. Uh, Kevin Beek just Googled integralism kind of frightening. Yeah, it is. Joni, why are a lot of the post-structuralists so against Hegelian dialectics? I think it's in part. So this is kind of a good history of philosophy thing, right? When you read French philosophy in the 20th century, and you see them reacting against stuff, you can't just imagine it to be like Hegelian dialectics per se. It's Hegelian dialectics as people were doing it in the French Academy. When they're rejecting Marxism, they're not rejecting all Marxism. They're rejecting the kind of crap that was going on in France at the time. When they're rejecting this, they're rejecting that. It's often much more driven by the sterility and rigidity of the way philosophy was being done in France. It's not necessarily applicable directly to the way things are in the States or Canada or Britain or Germany or pick wherever else you want it to be. Um, R says, which is best to read the secondary source, then read the primary source, or go straight to the primary source? There's no good answer for that. I mean, it depends on you and the kind of reader you are and how you're reading. I mean, I personally think that you should probably take a stab at the primary text first and, see what you can do with it. And obviously, you're not going to understand most of what you read, and that's okay. And then, rely on some secondary sources to give you some understanding of it. I mean, here's the one thing you don't want to do: just rely solely on secondary sources about things, right? Because you have no clue whether the person's right or not. And the other thing you don't want to do is like slavishly buy into a secondary source, particularly if it's very schematically oriented. Like these are the rationals, so these are the empiricists, and then we get Kant. Um, because you're gonna come in with these blinders that you've accepted uncritically from somebody else's reading, and it's going to keep you from reading the primary text. But with any primary text, if you want to get to know it, you're going to have to read and reread and reread. And so it's perfectly fine to go back and forth and back and forth. Same thing, by the way, with the videos that I do. I don't think that anybody should rely on my videos or anybody else's as a substitute for actually reading the text. I think that if you want to understand Plato, you've got to actually read Plato at some point in time. Otherwise, you're working with somebody's, imitation or shadow, to use Platonic, uh, uh, language of the original pattern that you're supposed to be checking out. And you deprive yourself of kind of a cool opportunity to engage something that people over millennia have found quite valuable. All right, Fireball, thoughts on Deleuze? I like Deleuze. I'm not a fan of Deleuze with Guattari. I think that he does better work on his own, and I'm not a fan of Deleuzians because they often, are pretty jargony, and they'll be like body without organs, body without organs. And I think there's a lot of like readers of Deleuze. I think there's an awful lot of jargon doing the work that should be done by actual thinking, which is a point that Deleuze himself makes. over and over again, right? In his own work. Um, all right. So Dr. Beavis says, funny, I just started reading Capitalism and Schizophrenia. It's a tough, tough book. Yeah, I mean, most late 20th century French philosophy is tough stuff to read, you know. And in part, it's a function of that style that they adopt. A little bit too clever, a little bit too precious, a little bit too showing off, which is not helpful. Um, but there's often some nuggets that are worth bringing out. All right. Joe Stanbury, what's your opinion on God's violence in the Bible, in particular, the few cases in the New Testament? I mean, I don't know what you're asking me there. Are you asking me to like decide whether God's good or not, or something like that in the New Test or the Old Testament? I mean, if you read the Old Testament, you're not actually going to find that much violence anyway. You're going to find a lot of human people doing things. Sometimes, because God told them to do things. Sometimes against what God told them to do. I think there's this caricature of the awful Old Testament and the very nice, meek New Testament that we probably want to be a little bit more realistic about. I mean, if you want a book where God is a real asshole, look at the last book of the New Testament, which, by the way, some of the people, in the early period were like, this book shouldn't be in here. The revelation of John, right? Um, that's full of hateful imagery, isn't it? So I would avoid that dichotomy. Um, Snake says, have you read the Strugatsky brothers books? Hard to Be a God is such a fantastic novel. I haven't yet. I mean, down the line when I get to it, but I've got so much other reading to do. People are saying it's good, and most of the times that people are recommending science fiction or fantasy or horror people to me, they've been pretty good. So right now I am finishing up another fan recommendation that got voted in. Dan Simmons. I've got, just a bit more of Fall of Endymion to go to finish up the Hyperion Cantos. Um, Pipeline, do you have any stance on panpsychism? It's thrown a lot of as a term at the moment. I don't take it seriously. I don't think that everything is conscious. So it's kind of a non starter for me. Um, we're a little bit over time, and I've got a thing I got to do, so I'll take a few more. Rizzard, how much reading would you recommend for an undergraduate to do every day or for a week? It totally depends on who the undergraduate is, right? And how much time you have available, and how much reading works for you. You might, if you're lucky enough to be able to read 8 hours a day, you might not be able to read 8 hours a day. Maybe you get to like the 6 hour mark and your eyes are glazed over and you're like, shit, I'm not recognizing anything of what I'm actually reading here. So it's going to vary considerably. I don't have recommendations like that sort of thing. Um, Kevin, which modern philosophers incorporate politics in their assessment of a good life? Do any? Um, yeah, I mean, literally hundreds. I mean, and it depends on what you mean by modern. Are you talking about contemporary, or are you talking about the actual modern period, which we generally is like 1600s to the 1800. I mean, if you're talking about that period, Descartes himself does that, Spinoza does that, Hobbes does that, and we could go on and on and on from there. But if you're talking about contemporary thinkers, there's too many to name. um, Oh, here's an interesting question. This is a good one to end on. Did you ever lose yourself in your philosophical development? Sometimes I lose hope in entirety of my potential in my studies. Is it normal to have ups and downs in a philosophical career? So that's actually a great question. So I'm not sure what lose yourself means here. Like at first, I thought you meant like get so absorbed in something that you're like not paying attention to other things, and that certainly happened to me at different points. Um, but I think judging from the rest of what you're saying, losing hope in your potential in your studies, is it normal to have ups and downs? Yeah, it's totally normal. You're not a machine, you are a person, and philosophy or whatever else you're studying is just a part of your life, and it can be a very important, meaningful part of your life. But the other stuff that's going on, is important, and not everything has to be turned into like an opportunity to practice philosophy or an opportunity to like think about things. I mean, it's fine to have like a year where you don't read any philosophical texts and you're just focusing on staying afloat psychologically or health wise or in terms of living your relations with other people. I'll tell you an interesting story about a guy who some of you heard me talk about before, Nick Barron, who is teaching down in Southern Indiana. He's a guy I met in graduate school. He came in around the same time as me, and we had some classes together. And he was kind of a shy, unassuming person, but he really liked Augustine, and he ended up writing his dissertation on Augustine. And so he was ready to start work on his PhD, and his mom got sick, and he had 11 brothers and sisters. And I guess they were all pricks. I mean, he wouldn't describe him that way, but he's a really nice guy, way nicer than me. And I'll call them pricks because not a single one of them was willing to take care of her as she was dying of cancer. So Nick leaves, he took a leave of absence and he went down to Southern Indiana, actually across, because Southern Illinois and Southern Indiana are about, on the same latitude. And he spent several years just taking care of her and the house and all that sort of stuff as she slowly died. And then he did the all the other stuff that was required too, handling the estate and dealing with all these prick brothers and sisters who each wanted their little share of the proceeds and stuff like that. And then he came back, and I was just sort of finishing up in the department when he like walked into my office and he's like, hey, I'm back, and we chatted and stuff like that. And obviously it took him a much longer time, right? Sometimes things like that happen. It's not like he couldn't study philosophy afterwards. um, that's okay for things like that, to give a priority to uh, matters like your family. That can be quite all right, or your health, your mental health, other things along those lines. There are going to be ups and downs, and so I think there are some people for whom that doesn't happen, but most of us, we go through periods where we can be more productive or less productive or more interested or less interested. And not all of that has to be turned into wonderful opportunities for growth either. It's okay to have obstacles and setbacks. The obstacle doesn't always have to become the way, right? We don't have to do all this happy dappy inspirational shit, you know? It's okay just to be what we are and who we are, and try to do the best that we can with things. And the best doesn't always have to be like somebody else's best. So that's what I have to say about that. And that's where we'll leave off with. We do one of these every month. So if you didn't get your question answered here, although I think I got to nearly all of them, we could do it next time. Thanks for all the great questions. And I'll see you in some of the other online events.